The stagecoach lurched violently to one side, its wooden frame groaning as the wheels locked against the narrow rock walls of the mountain pass, and Nora Brennan knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die in this God-forsaken stretch of the Colorado Rockies in the summer of 1876. "We're stuck fast," the driver shouted down, his voice tight with panic. "Pass is too narrow. We cannot go forward or back." Nora pressed her gloved hand against the window frame, her heart hammering against her corset as she peered out at the sheer drop just inches from the coach's right side. The mountain fell away into nothing, a dizzying plunge of at least 300 feet into a rocky gorge below. On the left side, jagged granite pressed so close she could have reached out and scraped her fingers against it. "What do we do?" called Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman sharing the coach, her face gone pale as milk. Before anyone could answer, a sound like thunder rolled through the pass. Nora's breath caught as she realized it was not thunder at all but hoofbeats coming fast from somewhere above them. She craned her neck, trying to see through the dusty window, and then he appeared. The man who rode down the steep mountainside with the confidence of someone born to these peaks sat astride a massive roan horse, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible given the treacherous terrain. He was broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his buckskin shirt stretched across a chest that spoke of years spent wrestling with this unforgiving wilderness. Dark hair hung past his shoulders, partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and even from a distance, Nora could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes as he assessed the situation. "You folks are in a bad way," he called out, his voice deep and steady. He swung down from his horse with easy strength, landing on the narrow ledge beside the stagecoach with the sure-footedness of a mountain cat. The driver scrambled down from his perch, nearly stumbling in his haste. "We tried to make it through. The pass looked wider from below. Now we're wedged tight." The stranger walked the length of the coach, his expression grave as he examined how the walls had trapped them. Up close, Nora could see the rugged planes of his face, the strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he tested the coach's position. He was perhaps 27 or 28, she estimated, though the sun had weathered his skin in a way that made him seem both older and ageless. "You cannot stay here," he said flatly. "There's a storm building to the west. When it hits, this pass will flood. The runoff comes down like a river." "We have to get through," the driver insisted. "I have a schedule to keep." "Your schedule does not mean much to a flash flood." The stranger's tone was matter-of-fact, without judgment. "I know another way. Narrow trail, steep in places, but it will bring you around to the other side of this pass and down to the valley road." "A trail? This coach cannot handle rough terrain." "I know. That is why the passengers will have to ride." He glanced at the coach, and his eyes met Nora's through the window. The contact lasted only a moment, but something passed between them, some recognition she could not name. "How many inside?" "Two ladies, Mrs. Henderson and Miss Brennan." The stranger moved to the coach door and pulled it open. "Ladies, I am Ethan Thorne. I've been trapping and guiding in these mountains for 10 years. I can get you to safety, but you will need to trust me and do exactly as I say." Mrs. Henderson clutched her traveling bag to her chest. "I cannot ride a horse. I'm 63 years old." "You will ride with me," Ethan said, his voice gentle now. "My horse can carry us both. He is strong and steady." Then his gaze shifted to Nora, and she felt the full weight of his attention. "Can you ride, miss?" "I can," Nora said, lifting her chin. She had grown up on a ranch outside of Denver before her father's death had forced her to seek work in the city. The past 3 years of teaching school and living in boarding houses had not erased the skills her father had taught her. "I rode almost before I could walk." Something that might have been approval flickered in Ethan's eyes. "Good. The driver's horse will carry you. We will need to leave the coach here. Take only what you can carry in a small bag. The rest will have to wait until we can send a proper team to free the coach." "But my trunk," Mrs. Henderson protested weakly. "Your trunk will not do you any good at the bottom of a gorge," Ethan said, though his tone remained kind. "I am sorry, but we must move quickly." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of activity. The driver, a thin man named Porter, helped Mrs. Henderson gather her most precious belongings into a carpet bag while Nora did the same. She had little enough with her, traveling as she was to take up a new teaching position in a mining town called Silver Creek. Her mother's silver locket, a few changes of clothes, her teaching certificate, and the small Bible her father had given her on her 10th birthday. Everything fit into a single leather satchel. Ethan worked with swift efficiency, unhitching one of the team horses and fashioning a makeshift bridle from spare leather. His hands were large and capable, scarred from hard work, but surprisingly deft. When he lifted Mrs. Henderson onto his roan, he did so with a gentleness that belied his strength, making sure she was secure before he swung up behind her. "Porter, you will ride the other team horse," Ethan instructed. "Stay close and follow my lead. The trail is narrow in places, and your mount is not familiar with mountain paths." Then he turned to Nora. The horse he had prepared for her was a sturdy bay gelding, still wearing its harness markings. Ethan held the reins as she approached, and without being asked, he moved to help her mount. His hands spanned her waist, and even through the layers of her traveling dress and corset, she felt the warmth and strength of his grip as he lifted her effortlessly into the saddle. "Sit deep and trust the horse," he said, looking up at her. "He knows to follow mine. If the path frightens you, look at me, not down." "I will be fine," Nora said, gathering the reins. She had ridden side saddle for years, though her current position, with one leg hooked around the pommel and her skirts arranged as modestly as possible, was far from ideal. "Thank you for doing this." "Thank me when we are all safe," Ethan replied. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at her, a warmth that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. They set off with Ethan in the lead, Mrs. Henderson secured in front of him, followed by Nora, and then Porter bringing up the rear. The path Ethan led them onto was barely visible, a faint track that hugged the mountainside and climbed steadily upward. Nora's horse followed the roan without hesitation, picking its way over loose stones and around jutting outcroppings with more confidence than she felt. The pass fell away behind them, and soon they were traversing a landscape of raw beauty and danger. Pine forests clung to impossible slopes, and in the distance, granite peaks thrust toward a sky that was beginning to darken with the promised storm. The air smelled of pine resin and approaching rain. "Are you managing?" Ethan called back to her after they had been riding for perhaps half an hour. "Yes," Nora answered, though her legs were beginning to ache from the unfamiliar position. "We will stop to rest soon. There's a shelf ahead where the horses can catch their breath." True to his word, he led them to a wider section of trail where a flat outcropping provided space for all of them to dismount. Mrs. Henderson was shaking when Ethan helped her down, and he guided her to sit on a fallen log, speaking to her in low, reassuring tones. Nora slid from her horse, grateful for the chance to stretch. Her traveling dress was already dusty and rumpled, and she could feel where the side saddle had rubbed uncomfortably, but she was not about to complain. They were alive and moving toward safety, and that was what mattered. "Let me check your stirrup," Ethan said, appearing at her side. He adjusted the leather strap, his fingers working with practiced ease. "It was riding a bit uneven. This should be better." "You are very kind to help us," Nora said. "Most men would have ridden past, not wanting the trouble." Ethan glanced at her, and for the first time, she saw a hint of humor in his expression. "Most men do not know these mountains well enough to ride past safely, and I could not leave you there. The flood would have come by nightfall. Still, you had no obligation to us." "Maybe not." He straightened, and standing this close, Nora realized just how tall he was. She was not a small woman at 5 feet and 6 inches, but Ethan towered over her by at least half a foot. But a man does not measure his worth by his obligations. He measures it by what he does when no one is forcing his hand. The simple philosophy, spoken without pretension, struck something deep in Nora's chest. She had known educated men in Denver, men who could quote poetry and philosophy, but none of them had possessed the quiet confidence and integrity that seemed to radiate from this mountain man. "Where did you learn to think like that?" she asked. "My father. He was a trapper, too. He taught me that the wilderness shows you who you really are because there is no one else around to pretend for." Ethan looked out at the mountains, his profile strong against the darkening sky. "He died when I was 17. Avalanche took him. I have been on my own since then." "I am sorry," Nora said softly. "I lost my father 3 years ago. Illness, not accident, but the loss is the same." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Nora felt a connection form, a recognition of shared grief and understanding. Ethan nodded slowly. "It is the same. I'm sorry for your loss as well." Porter called out that Mrs. Henderson was ready to continue, breaking the spell. Ethan helped Nora back onto her horse, and they resumed their journey. The trail grew steeper, winding through dense forest where the shadows were deep and cool. Nora found herself watching Ethan's broad back, the confident way he sat his horse, the gentle manner in which he spoke to Mrs. Henderson when she gasped at a particularly steep section. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of rain. Ethan urged them to move faster, and the horses responded to the urgency, picking up their pace even as the path grew more treacherous. Nora clung to the reins, trusting her mount as Ethan had instructed, and tried not to look at the increasingly dramatic drops to their right. They were crossing a section where the trail narrowed to barely 3 feet wide, with the mountain rising sharply on one side and falling away on the other, when the storm finally broke. Rain came down in sheets, cold and driving, soaking through Nora's traveling cloak within seconds. The trail turned slick, and she felt her horse's hooves slip on the wet rock. "Easy," she murmured, leaning forward to steady the animal. "Easy now." Ahead, Ethan had stopped, twisting in his saddle to look back. "There is an overhang just ahead," he shouted over the roar of the rain. "We can shelter there." They pushed forward, and Nora had never been so grateful to see a shallow cave in her life. It was barely deep enough to be called a cave, really just a place where the rock jutted out enough to provide cover, but it was dry. Ethan helped Mrs. Henderson down first, then turned to assist Nora. His hands closed around her waist again, and he lifted her down as though she weighed nothing. For a moment, she was pressed against his chest, and she could feel the solid strength of him, the warmth despite the cold rain. Their eyes met, and something shifted in his expression, a softening that made her breath catch. "You did well," he said quietly. "You are a strong rider." "I had good teachers," Nora replied, though her voice came out breathier than she intended. She was acutely aware of his hands still at her waist, of how close they stood. A gust of wind drove rain into the shallow cave, and Ethan released her, moving to tend to the horses. He tethered them where they would have some protection from the worst of the weather, speaking to each animal with the same gentleness he showed the people under his care. Mrs. Henderson sank down against the cave wall, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "How long will we need to wait?" "Not long," Ethan said. "These mountain storms blow through quickly. We will give it an hour, maybe less, then continue. We should reach the valley road by nightfall if we keep a steady pace." He settled near the cave's opening, watching the storm. Porter found a spot to sit and promptly closed his eyes, exhausted by the tension of the ride. Nora remained standing, looking out at the rain-swept landscape. Despite the danger and discomfort, there was something magnificent about the storm, the way it transformed the mountains into a world of silver and shadow. "You are not frightened?" Ethan asked from beside her. She had not heard him approach. "I am terrified," Nora admitted, "but I am also alive, and there is something about that which makes the fear almost exhilarating." He studied her face, and she met his gaze steadily. "Most people would be demanding to know why I led them into a storm. You did not lead us into it. You led us away from something worse, and I trust that you know what you are doing." "How can you trust that? You have known me for less than 3 hours." Nora considered the question seriously. "Because everything about the way you carry yourself tells me you are competent. Because you have been kind without being condescending. Because you risked yourself to help strangers." She paused. "And because my father taught me to read people, and I see in you someone who knows these mountains as well as I once knew my father's ranch." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A frightened city woman who would panic at the first sign of trouble." He smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face, making him look younger and impossibly handsome. "I'm glad to be wrong." Warmth spread through Nora's chest, and she found herself smiling back. "I was a city woman for only 3 years. Before that, I was as much a part of the land as anyone. My father ran cattle in the foothills outside Denver. I spent my childhood on horseback." "What changed?" "He died. The ranch had debts I could not manage. I sold it and went to Denver to train as a teacher." She looked down at her hands, remembering those difficult days. It was the practical choice, but not the choice you wanted. No, Nora admitted. I miss the open spaces, the freedom, the feeling of being part of something larger than parlors and tea parties and discussing who is courting whom. Is that why you were traveling to Silver Creek? It is a rough mining town, not much in the way of parlors. That's exactly why. The school board in Denver thought I was mad to accept the position, but I needed to get back to country where I could breathe. Ethan's expression was thoughtful. Silver Creek is certainly that. It sits at 8,000 feet, surrounded by some of the most beautiful and unforgiving terrain in Colorado. You will be able to breathe there, though the air's thin. You know it? I supply the general store there with game and furs. I pass through every few weeks. Something flickered in his eyes. I suppose I will see you again then. The thought sent a flutter through Nora's stomach. I suppose you will. The rain was beginning to lighten, the heavy downpour giving way to a steady drizzle. Ethan checked the sky with an experienced eye. Another 15 minutes and we can move on. The worst has passed. They set out again when the rain had reduced to little more than mist. The trail remained slick, forcing them to move slowly, but the horses managed well. Nora's bay had proven to be sure-footed and calm, and she patted his neck in silent thanks as they navigated a particularly steep descent. The landscape began to change as they dropped in elevation. The bare rock and scrubby pines gave way to fuller forest, and eventually the trail widened into something more resembling an actual road. By the time the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold behind the western peaks, they emerged onto the main valley road. We made it, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice trembling with relief. Thank God. Thank Ethan Thorne, Nora corrected gently, and the older woman nodded vigorously. Yes, of course. Mr. Thorne, I do not know how to repay you. No payment needed, Ethan said. There's a way station about 3 miles down this road. They will have beds and hot food. Porter, you and the ladies can rest there tonight and catch tomorrow's coach to Silver Creek. What about you? Nora asked before she could stop herself. Ethan swung down from his horse and helped Mrs. Henderson dismount. I have business in the high country. I will head back up after I see you all safely to the station. Disappointment, sharp and unexpected, lanced through Nora's chest. She had known him for only hours, had exchanged perhaps a few dozen sentences with him, but the thought of him disappearing back into the mountains left her feeling oddly bereft. He came to help her down, and this time when his hands circled her waist, she let herself linger against him for just a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, she said, looking up into his face. You saved our lives today. I'm glad I was there to help. His voice was low, intimate despite the presence of the others. Be safe in Silver Creek, Nora Brennan. It is a good town, but it can be rough. I will be careful, she promised, though what she wanted to say was something else entirely. Stay. Come with us. Do not disappear into the wilderness when I have only just found you. But she said none of those things because she barely knew this man, and she was being foolish, letting a handsome face and strong arms and a few kind words affect her so strongly. She was 23 years old and educated, not some silly girl who believed in love at first sight. They rode the remaining distance to the way station in the gathering darkness. The station was a welcome sight, a sturdy log building with warm light spilling from its windows and smoke rising from its chimney. The station master, a gruff man named Callahan, took charge of Mrs. Henderson and Porter, promising hot stew and clean beds. Nora stood in the yard, watching as Ethan prepared to leave. He swung into his saddle with fluid grace, then looked down at her. For a long moment, they simply gazed at each other, and Nora felt that same pull, that sense of recognition and connection. Goodbye, Nora, he said finally. Goodbye, Ethan. He touched the brim of his hat, then wheeled his horse and rode back toward the mountains, disappearing into the twilight. Nora stood watching until long after he was gone, ignoring the chill in the air and the voice in her head that told her she was being ridiculous. The next day passed in a blur of travel. The morning coach arrived at 10, and Nora, Mrs. Henderson, and Porter boarded along with several other passengers. Mrs. Henderson talked endlessly about their adventure, embellishing the danger with each retelling, but Nora remained quiet, looking out the window at the passing landscape and thinking about a man with dark hair and strong hands who had appeared when she needed him most. Silver Creek was everything she'd been told to expect and nothing she had imagined. The town clung to the mountainside like a barnacle to a ship, a collection of rough wooden buildings and canvas tents that housed the several hundred souls who had come seeking silver in the rich veins that ran through these peaks. The main street was a churning mess of mud and ore wagons, men shouting and mules braying, the constant thunder of the stamp mills processing or drowning out all other sound. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a neat log building that someone had painted white and fitted with real glass windows. Nora's quarters were attached to the back, a single room with a bed, stove, table, and chair. It was Spartan, but clean, and after 3 days of travel, it felt like luxury. She spent the next week settling in and preparing for the start of the school term. The town had 23 children of school age, ranging from 6 to 14, and Nora threw herself into creating lesson plans and organizing the limited supplies the school board had provided. The work was satisfying, and the people of Silver Creek, while rough around the edges, were welcoming. But in the quiet moments, usually in the evening after her preparations were complete, Nora found her thoughts drifting to Ethan Thorne. She told herself it was merely gratitude and the natural romance of their dramatic meeting, but she could not quite convince herself. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something in the connection she felt, that went deeper than simple appreciation. 3 weeks after her arrival in Silver Creek, Nora was walking back from the general store with supplies for her classroom when she heard a commotion near the livery stable. A crowd had gathered, and she could hear raised voices. Curious and slightly concerned, she approached, trying to see what had caused the disturbance. Then the crowd parted slightly, and she saw him. Ethan stood beside his roan horse, his expression hard as he faced down 3 men who were clearly drunk despite the early hour. They were miners by the look of them, still filthy with rock dust and spoiling for a fight. "I said the price is fair," Ethan was saying, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "Take it or leave it, but stop wasting my time." "Your prices are robbery," one of the miners slurred. "You think because you are the only trapper who comes through regular that you can charge whatever you want?" "I charge what the meat is worth. If you do not like it, hunt your own game." One of the miners stepped forward aggressively, and Nora saw Ethan's posture shift, his weight settling in a way that suggested he knew how to handle himself in a fight. She acted without thinking, pushing through the crowd. "Ethan!" she called out, and his head snapped toward her, surprise flashing across his face. "Ethan Thorne, is that you?" The use of his full name and her tone, as though they were old acquaintances meeting by chance, gave everyone pause. Ethan recovered quickly, and something that might have been relief crossed his expression. "Miss Brennan," he said, moving toward her and away from the confrontation. "I had heard you made it safely to Silver Creek." "Thanks to you." She smiled up at him, very aware of the crowd watching. The miners, robbed of their target, were already losing interest and drifting away, muttering among themselves. "I hoped I might see you again. You said you came through town regularly." "I do." He was looking at her as though she were water and he had been crossing a desert. "I did not expect to see you breaking up fights, though." "I was not breaking up anything," Nora said innocently, "merely greeting an old friend." The corner of his mouth quirked up. "Is that what we are? Old friends?" "We survived a mountain storm together. I think that qualifies." The crowd was dispersing, the excitement over. Ethan glanced around, then back at Nora. "Do you have time for coffee? There's a decent cafe 2 buildings down that is quieter than it looks." "I have time," Nora said, perhaps too quickly. They walked to the cafe together, and Nora was intensely aware of the curious looks they drew. Silver Creek was small enough that a new schoolteacher walking with a known mountain man would be noticed and discussed. She found she did not care. The cafe was indeed quieter than its rough exterior suggested. They took a table near the back, and a tired-looking woman brought them coffee without being asked. Ethan wrapped his large hands around the cup, and Nora noticed the fresh scars on his knuckles, the way his shoulders seemed to relax slightly now that he was sitting. "Thank you," he said after a moment, "for what you did back there." "Did I do something?" "You know you did. Those men were looking for trouble, and you gave them a reason to back down without losing face. That was clever." Nora sipped her coffee, which was strong enough to strip paint. I could not stand by and watch you get into a fight over something so petty. It was not entirely petty. They were not wrong that I am one of the few reliable sources of fresh game in this area, but I am not going to lower my prices just because they spent their wages on whiskey and now cannot afford proper food. You should not have to, Nora agreed. Your work is valuable, and you should be paid fairly for it. They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily. Ethan asked about the school, and Nora found herself telling him about her students, about the challenges of teaching children who ranged so widely in age and ability, about her pleasure at being back in mountain country. He told her about his trap lines, about the animals he tracked, about the changing seasons in the high peaks and the hard beauty of a land that gave nothing easily. Do you ever get lonely? Nora asked, living up there by yourself? Ethan considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but I have always been comfortable with solitude. My father raised me to be self-sufficient, and after he died, I found I preferred my own company to most others. He paused, though I have been finding lately that my cabin feels more isolated than it used to. Something in the way he looked at her when he said it made Nora's pulse quicken. Perhaps you need to spend more time in town. Perhaps I do. He walked her back to the schoolhouse, carrying the supplies she had purchased. At her door, he set them down and stood there, his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Would you mind if I called on you? He asked. Properly, I mean. I know you have only just arrived in town and you might not want complications, but I have not been able to stop thinking about you since that day in the mountains. Joy, bright and unexpected, bloomed in Nora's chest. I would like that very much. I have not been able to stop thinking about you either. His smile, when it came, was like sunrise. Then I will see you again soon. I need to head back up to check my trap lines, but I will return in a week. May I take you to dinner? You may. He touched her hand briefly, a whisper of contact that somehow felt more intimate than a kiss, then turned and walked away. Nora stood in her doorway, watching him go, and felt as though her life had just shifted onto a new path. The week passed slowly. Nora threw herself into her teaching, and the children responded well to her methods. She found particular satisfaction in working with the older students, many of whom had received only sporadic education and were hungry to learn. In the evenings, she prepared lessons and tried not to count the days until Ethan's return. True to his word, he appeared exactly 1 week later, riding into town just as the school day ended. Nora was wiping down the chalkboard when she heard the children shouting outside, and she went to the window to see Ethan dismounting near the schoolhouse, several of her students already clustering around him. She watched as he spoke to them, patient and kind, showing them something he pulled from his saddlebag. When she stepped outside, she saw it was a piece of shed antler, the bone pale and surprisingly heavy. This came from an elk, Ethan was explaining to an enraptured audience. You can tell by the size and the way the points branch. A deer's antlers look different. How big was the elk? Asked Tommy, one of her most curious students. Big enough that I did not argue with him about keeping his antler, Ethan said, and the children laughed. He looked up and saw Nora, and his expression softened. Miss Brennan, I hope I am not interrupting your lessons. School is dismissed for the day, Nora said. You are just in time. She turned to her students. Go on home, all of you. Mind you do your reading assignments. The children scattered with the usual chaos, though several called goodbye to Ethan as they went. When they were alone, he approached her, still holding the antler. I thought you might like this, he said, for your classroom. The children seemed interested in it. That is very thoughtful. Nora took the antler, admiring the smooth bone and the weight of it. They will love examining it. Tommy especially is fascinated by animals. He reminds me of myself at that age, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. They stood there, smiling at each other, until Nora remembered herself. Would you like to come in? I can make tea. I would rather take you to dinner, if the invitation still stands. It does. Let me just get my shawl. The restaurant Ethan took her to was surprisingly nice, given the rough nature of Silver Creek. It was run by a Chinese family who had come to work on the railroad and stayed to serve the mining community. The food was a mixture of Chinese dishes and American fare, all of it delicious. They talked through the entire meal, and Nora found herself telling Ethan things she had not shared with anyone, about her father's final illness, about her struggle to make sense of life in Denver, about her dreams for her students in Silver Creek. He listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions, and in turn shared his own stories of growing up in the mountains, of learning to read the land, of close calls with weather and wildlife. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man," Nora said as they finished their meal. "He was. He taught me everything worth knowing." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He also taught me that when you find something worth keeping, you hold on to it. He said that about my mother, said he knew the day he met her that she was meant to be his." "What happened to your mother?" "She died giving birth to what would have been my sister. I was 5. I barely remember her, just impressions, really. The sound of her laugh, the way she smelled like sage and sunshine." He looked at Nora. "My father never remarried. He said he had his one great love, and that was enough for a lifetime." The weight of his words and the way he looked at her when he spoke them made Nora's breath catch. "Do you believe that?" she asked softly. "That people have one great love? I used to think it was just a story he told himself to explain his loneliness. Now I'm beginning to think he might have been right." They walked back to the schoolhouse slowly, neither of them eager to end the evening. The mountain air was cool and sharp with the scent of pine, and overhead stars blazed in a sky so clear it seemed close enough to touch. At her door, Ethan took both her hands in his. "May I see you again?" "Yes," Nora said simply. "As often as you like." "I have to go back up the mountain tomorrow, but I could return in 5 days. Would that be too soon?" "It would not be soon enough, but I will wait." He lifted one of her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth racing up her arm. 5 days, then. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Ethan would spend several days checking his trap lines and hunting, then return to Silver Creek to sell his game and furs and spend time with Nora. They took walks in the foothills around the town, and he showed her tracks and signs she had forgotten how to read during her years in the city. They had dinner together, sometimes at the restaurant, sometimes at her small quarters where she cooked simple meals on her stove. They talked about everything and nothing, and with each meeting, Nora felt herself falling deeper in love. It was not just his strength or his competence, though those qualities certainly attracted her. It was the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened, as though her words mattered. It was his gentleness with her students when he stopped by the school. It was the thoughtful gifts he brought her, small things like interesting rocks or feathers or once a perfect pine cone that he thought she might like. It was the way he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. 6 weeks after their first dinner together, Ethan arrived in town on a day when heavy gray clouds hung low over the peaks. Nora saw him from the schoolhouse window and felt the now familiar flutter in her chest at the sight of him. He dismounted and stood looking up at the threatening sky, his expression troubled. "Early snow," he said when she came out to greet him. "I can smell it. There will be a storm tonight, a big one. Will you be able to get back to your cabin before it hits?" He shook his head. "Not safely. I will need to stay in town until it passes. Callahan at the way station will give me a room." They had dinner together, but Ethan seemed distracted, constantly glancing at the windows, watching the sky. When he walked Nora home, the first flakes were beginning to fall, large and heavy. "This is going to be bad," he said. "Nora, promise me you will stay inside tomorrow. Do not try to hold school. This kind of storm can turn deadly fast." "I promise," she said, though she was more concerned about him. "Will you be safe at the way station?" "I will be fine. It is a solid building, and Callahan keeps supplies." He cupped her face in his hands, looking down at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I love you." The words came out rough, almost fierce. "I have loved you since the day I pulled you and Mrs. Henderson out of that pass. I know it is fast, and maybe you think I am crazy, but my father was right. When you know, you know." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too. I have been trying to tell myself it was too soon, that I barely knew you, but none of that matters. I love you, Ethan Thorne." He kissed her then, a deep, claiming kiss that spoke of passion held in check and the promise of more to come. When they finally broke apart, snow was falling steadily around them, coating the world in white. "When this storm passes," Ethan said, his forehead resting against hers, I'm going to ask you properly to marry me. I'm going to do this right, the way you deserve." "I will say yes," Nora whispered, "just so you know." His laugh was warm against her skin. "Good, that is good." The storm was even worse than Ethan had predicted. Snow fell for 3 days straight, piling up in drifts higher than a man's head. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled through Silver Creek like a living thing. Nora stayed in her quarters, keeping the stove burning constantly and worrying about Ethan, despite knowing he was safe. When the storm finally broke, the world had been transformed into a landscape of white silence. Nora ventured out carefully, marveling at the way the snow had sculpted itself into strange shapes against buildings and trees. The children would not be able to get to school for days, not until the main paths had been cleared, so she occupied herself with preparing lessons and trying not to pace with impatience. It was late afternoon on the day after the storm ended when she heard someone calling her name. She went to the window and saw Ethan wading through the deep snow, moving with purposeful strength toward the schoolhouse. She met him at the door, and he swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of relief and love and need. "I've been going mad," he said into her hair, "stuck at the station, unable to get to you, not knowing if you were safe." "I was fine," Nora assured him, though her own heart was pounding with the joy of having him near again. "But I missed you terribly." He set her down but kept his arms around her. "Marry me, Nora Brennan. I know I do not have much to offer you. My cabin is small and rough, and the life of a trapper's wife is hard. But I will love you with everything I have for as long as I live. Marry me." "Yes," Nora said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her again, and this kiss was different from the last, full of joy and promise and the certainty of a shared future. When they finally came up for air, both of them were laughing. "I do not have a ring," Ethan said. "I need to go to Denver to get you a proper one. I do not need a ring yet. I just need you." Nora took his hands, looking up at him seriously. "But you need to know, I will not give up teaching. Not right away. The children here need me, at least through the end of the school year." "I would never ask you to give it up," Ethan said firmly. "You are a teacher. That is part of who you are. We will find a way to make it work." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. Ethan would continue his trapping through the winter, but he would base himself primarily in Silver Creek so he could be close to Nora. In the spring, they would marry, and Nora would finish out the school year. After that, they could decide together where they wanted to make their permanent home. "I have been thinking," Ethan said as evening approached, "that I might transition away from trapping. I could guide hunting parties, maybe even lead supply trains between the mining camps. It would be steadier work, and I could be home more." "Would you be happy doing that?" Nora asked. "I do not want you to change who you are for me." "I would not be changing who I am. I would be adapting to a new situation, the way any sensible person does." He pulled her close, tucking her against his side. "Besides, 10 years of trapping is enough. I am ready for something different. I am ready for a life with you." News of their engagement spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. The town's residents, starved for any kind of entertainment, embraced the romance of the schoolteacher and the mountain man. Several of the miners' wives approached Nora to offer advice and assistance with wedding preparations, and she found herself welcomed into the community in a way she had not expected. The winter passed in a haze of happiness despite the harsh conditions. Ethan was true to his word, staying close to town and visiting Nora as often as propriety allowed. He built up the firewood supply at the schoolhouse, checked her supplies regularly, and became a familiar and welcome presence to her students, who adored him. In February, he made the trip to Denver and returned with a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It reminded me of starlight on snow," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. "Like the night I told you I loved you." Nora cried, which made him panic until she assured him they were happy tears. The ring fit perfectly, and she found herself looking at it constantly, still amazed that this strong, kind man had chosen her. They set the wedding date for late May, when the snow would be fully melted and travel would be easier. Nora wrote to friends in Denver, inviting them to make the journey if they could. Mrs. Henderson, whom Nora had kept in touch with via letters, wrote back immediately saying she would not miss it for the world. As spring approached and the mountains began to shed their white blanket, Nora felt as though she were shedding an old life and preparing to step into a new one. The school year was coming to an end, and while she had agreed to teach one more year, she and Ethan had begun discussing building a small house on a piece of land he owned a few miles outside of town. It would be close enough for her to reach the school easily, but far enough to provide the privacy and space they both craved. "I want you to see the land before we commit to building there," Ethan said one evening in early April. "Make sure it is what you want." The next Sunday, he arrived with 2 horses and a pack of supplies. "We will camp overnight," he explained. "The land is about 3 hours' ride, beautiful country, and I want you to experience it properly." The ride was glorious. They followed a trail that wound through pine forests and across clear streams still running high with snowmelt. Ethan pointed out animal tracks and signs of spring, and Nora felt herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride, into the familiar pleasure of being on horseback in wild country. The land Ethan owned was everything Nora could have wanted. It sat in a high valley with views of the surrounding peaks, a meadow that would be full of wildflowers come summer, and a stream that ran along one edge. There was a stand of aspens near what Ethan said would be a perfect building site, their trunks white as bone and their new leaves fluttering like coins in the breeze. "What do you think?" Ethan asked, watching her face anxiously. "I think it is perfect," Nora said honestly. "I think it might be the most beautiful place I've ever seen." Relief and joy crossed his features. "Then we will build here. I've been sketching plans for the house, nothing fancy but solid and big enough that we can add rooms as we need them." As we need them. The implication made Nora's cheeks warm, but she did not look away. They had not spoken directly about children, but the assumption was there, the hope for a future that included more than just the 2 of them. They made camp near the stream, and Ethan demonstrated the skills that had kept him alive in the wilderness for a decade. He built a fire that burned hot and clean, cooked trout he caught in the stream with nothing but his hands and patience, and fashioned a shelter that would keep them dry and comfortable through the cool mountain night. As darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead, they sat together by the fire, Nora leaning back against Ethan's chest, his arms wrapped around her. The night was full of sounds, the rush of water over stones, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked softly. "Happier than I have ever been," Nora answered. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is real, that I found you, that all of this is mine. Not yours alone. Ours." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I keep thinking about that day in the pass, how easily I could have ridden past, how close I came to never meeting you. But you did not ride past. You stopped and helped, and here we are." "Here we are," he echoed, "building a life together in the most beautiful place on earth." They stayed up late talking, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future. When they finally slept, it was in their separate bedrolls, but close enough that Nora could hear Ethan's steady breathing, could feel the safety of his presence watching over her. The wedding took place on a perfect May morning when the meadows were full of wildflowers and the sky was a deep, endless blue. The ceremony was held outdoors, on the land where they would build their home, with the entire population of Silver Creek in attendance, along with a handful of guests from Denver. Nora wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that one of the miners' wives had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Ethan had picked that morning. He stood waiting for her in a new suit that he looked slightly uncomfortable in, his hair trimmed but still long enough to brush his collar, and when he saw her approaching, his face lit up with such joy that several people in the crowd wiped their eyes. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a traveling preacher who made the circuit through the mining towns. When Ethan said his vows, his voice was strong and clear, and he never took his eyes off Nora. "I promise to love you and protect you, to provide for you and stand beside you in the mountains and valleys in all seasons for the rest of my life." Nora's vows were equally simple and heartfelt. "I promise to love you and support you, to be your partner and your home, in adventure and peace, in all weathers for the rest of my life." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with such tender passion that the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Nora felt tears on her cheeks, but they were tears of pure happiness. The celebration that followed was joyous and chaotic in the best way. Tables had been set up laden with food that the townspeople had contributed, and someone produced a fiddle and another a guitar, and soon there was music and dancing. Ethan, who claimed he could not dance, nevertheless swept Nora around in circles until she was dizzy and laughing. Mrs. Henderson found Nora during a quiet moment and embraced her warmly. "I am so happy for you, dear girl. That is a good man you have married. I knew at the moment I saw how he handled that terrible situation in the past." "Thank you for coming all this way," Nora said. "It means the world to me. I would not have missed it. Besides, I wanted to see for myself that you made it safely to your new life." The older woman's eyes twinkled. "I have been telling everyone in Denver about the mountain man who rescued us. I fear I may have made him into something of a legend." Ethan appeared at Nora's elbow, overhearing the last part. "Please do not make me into a legend," he said with mock horror. "I am just a man who knows these mountains." "A man who saved our lives," Mrs. Henderson corrected, "and who won the heart of a wonderful woman. That is worth celebrating." As the sun began to set, casting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Ethan and Nora slipped away from the party. They walked hand in hand to the edge of the meadow, looking out at the peaks that surrounded them. "Are you ready for this?" Nora asked. "For marriage, for building a house, for all of it?" "I've never been more ready for anything," Ethan said. He turned to face her, taking both her hands. "You have changed everything for me, Nora. Before I met you, I was content enough, but I was not truly alive. Now I feel like every day is full of possibility." "I feel the same way." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "You gave me back the mountains, and you gave me love. I will never be able to repay you." "You do not need to repay me. Just love me back, and that is enough." They had arranged to spend their wedding night in Ethan's cabin, which he had spent weeks preparing. It was a full day's ride into the high country, so they left the party while it was still going strong, heading into the mountains under a sky beginning to fill with stars. The cabin was small, just a single room with a sleeping loft, but Ethan had made it as comfortable as he could. He had brought in wildflowers and set them in jars around the room, had stocked the shelves with supplies, had even managed to acquire a real mattress to replace his usual pile of furs and blankets. That night, as they consummated their marriage, Nora felt as though she were finally completely home. Ethan was gentle and passionate by turns, and afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Nora felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Ethan replied, his arms tightening around her. "Thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man." "Thank you for being exactly who you are," Nora said. "I would not change a single thing about you." They spent a week at the cabin, a honeymoon away from the world. Ethan showed Nora his favorite places, the hidden lakes and meadows he had discovered over years of ranging through these mountains. They fished and explored, and in the evenings they made love and talked about their plans for the future. "I have been thinking," Nora said one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and violet, "about teaching. I said I would do one more year, but I am not sure I want to stop after that." "You do not have to stop if you do not want to," Ethan said immediately. "I told you, I will never ask you to give up something important to you." "I know, but I also know that children change everything. When we have babies, teaching will be more difficult. Then we will hire someone to help, or you will teach from home, or we will find another solution." He pulled her closer. "Nora, you are one of the smartest people I have ever met. Whatever we face, we will figure it out together." The certainty in his voice, the absolute faith he had in their ability to navigate whatever challenges came, made Nora's heart swell with love. "You are right. We will figure it out." They returned to Silver Creek at the end of the week to begin their life in earnest. While Ethan started work on their house, enlisting help from several of the miners who owed him favors, Nora finished out the school year. In the evenings, she would ride out to the building site, and they would work together until darkness fell, Nora helping where she could, and Ethan teaching her the skills his father had taught him. The house took shape slowly but steadily. By the time the school year ended in late June, the frame was up and the roof was on. By August, they had walls and windows and a real floor. In September, they moved in, even though there was still work to be done on the interior. Nora loved the house immediately. It was small but beautifully built, with large windows that let in the mountain light and a stone fireplace that Ethan had constructed with his own hands. They had a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a separate bedroom, and a loft that could be used for storage or eventually children's rooms. That first night in their own home, they sat together in front of the fireplace, exhausted but happy. "We did it," Nora said, looking around at the space they had created together. "We actually built a house." "We built a home," Ethan corrected, kissing the top of her head. "There is a difference." The second school year was easier than the first. Nora knew her students and their families now, knew the rhythms of the town and the challenges they would face. Ethan had transitioned fully into guiding work, leading hunting parties in the fall and supply trains in the summer. The work paid better than trapping and kept him closer to home, just as he had hoped. In December, Nora realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with joy and terror in equal measure, but when she told Ethan, his reaction was pure delight. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she begged him to stop, laughing and crying at the same time. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "A baby, Nora." "You're going to be a father," she said, cupping his face and smiling through her tears. "You are going to be such a good father." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Nora continued teaching through April when the spring term ended. The baby was due in early July, and as the time drew near, Ethan became increasingly protective, barely wanting to let Nora out of his sight. "I am